This is Agnes McAlpin, the subject of my research. In 1897, a young Pennsylvania man left his middle-class home to go out to Alaska. Many others in his state were doing the same thing, hoping to strike it rich in the Klondike. But unlike other stampeders, Ken McAlpin brought his own gold to the north, hoping to insert it in the molars of other prospectors. Trained in dentistry, but not licensed to practice in his home state, Ken went north to find himself. Instead, he found Agnes Young, a 17-year-old of Haida and European ancestry. After falling violently in love with him, as he phrased it, violently in love with her, as he phrased it, he married her in Wrangell. The ceremony, performed in the first days of 1899, was officiated by a U.S. commissioner for the district. In attendance were the local Presbyterian minister and his wife, who knew the newlyweds well. While single, Ken and Agnes McAlpin had traveled in nearly identical social circles, although later Ken would deny that, claiming that his interracial marriage had lowered his status in Wrangell. To be sure, race relations in Wrangell at the turn of the last century were complicated. The unabashed racists who demanded a separate Presbyterian church for whites in Wrangell apparently made some exceptions for people like Agnes. While insisting on breaking off from the original Presbyterian mission church, built by and for the local Tlingit community, the segregationists said that they extended membership to persons of mixed blood who speak the English language. That, they thought, was good enough for God, although other whites in Wrangell said that there's no racial discrimination. Splitting hairs even more finely, the town's 1898 4th of July celebration organized separate dances for the elites, apparently a code word for white, for natives, and for, quote, half-natives. The half-native dance was organized by an interracial couple, a white attorney and his Simpson wife, who may have wanted to avoid unpleasantness with the elite. The dance was held in the husband's law office. About 25 couples attended, likely including Agnes's aunt Emma, a Haida woman, and Emma's non-native husband, Thomas J. Case, who was a local merchant in Wrangell. Agnes lived with these intermarried relatives, making social calls and entertaining visitors with them, having them over to hear their Victrola and rolling up the rug so everybody could dance quadrilles. Agnes wasn't originally from Wrangell. Since leaving Prince of Wales Island, where she'd spent most of her childhood in a fishing camp on Carter Bay, living there year-round, Agnes had attended a Juneau convent school. Her maternal grandfather was Charles Baranovich, a Catholic Croatian fur trader who died 3 years before Agnes's birth. Much has been written about Charles Baranovich, his alcohol smuggling, and his strategic marriage to the only daughter of Scowell, the powerful chief of the Haida village on the east coast of Prince of Wales Island, now referred to as Old Kisan. Omitted from these swashbuckling tales is the fact that Baranovich also established legitimate businesses, including a fish saltery, a farm, and a copper mine. He also made careful plans to leave these assets to his indigenous wife and children after his death, including Agnes's mother. But it's not clear that his instructions were followed. Alaska was a lawless place at the time, and Baranovich's heirs reportedly were robbed of at least part of his legacy. Some of Agnes's maternal aunts and uncles were Catholic, but her parents were founding members of the Presbyterian Church in present-day Kisan on Prince of Wales Island. Agnes's father, Paul Young, was a Presbyterian church deacon even while assuming the role of clan chief and continuing Haida traditional practices, presumably while the traveling pastor was elsewhere. In Wrangell, Agnes was an active Presbyterian. As the niece by marriage of an important local non-native merchant, fully proficient in written and spoken English, she may have belonged to the Second Presbyterian Church or White Church. We know for certain that she sang in a church choir and met Ken at a church social. 4 years older and more than a foot taller than Agnes, Ken often charmed women with what one woman called his, quote, massive form. Following a brief courtship, Ken proposed to Agnes after having her swear on a Bible never again to enter a Catholic church. But the marriage didn't prosper. Ken, perpetually in debt, advertised for dental patients only to turn them away when they came. Although not a drinker, he liked to stay up late at night, sleep past noon, and practice the mandolin. If dental patients came, he'd say, let them go away. Eventually, he abandoned dentistry altogether, doing a series of odd jobs, manual labor, from which he got fired after a week or two, and eventually giving his dental instruments to Agnes's uncle in partial repayment of his heavy debts to that uncle. Turning to other jobs, Ken moved his young wife to Washington State, where he barely managed to put food on the table. After a year of marriage, Ken took his now pregnant bride home to Butler, Pennsylvania, 40 miles north of Pittsburgh. There, his racist relatives, with his consent, subjugated Agnes to years of psychological abuse and economic dependency. But their attempts to sever her from society failed. Banished to a cheerless room, often forced to eat alone, and never introduced to visitors, she bore 3 children to a husband who refused to be seen with her in public. Ignored and barely tolerated, she contemplated suicide. Instead, against all odds, she managed to meet and befriend some prominent neighbors in Butler. Recruiting them as allies, she sued for divorce in a widely reported case that the press and public saw as a fight for human rights. Agnes's rejection by her in-laws must have come as a surprise. While Ken was up north, his mother had written repeatedly urging him to come home and see his gravely ill father. Responding to these entreaties, probably because Ken didn't bother to write back, Agnes wrote separately to each parent, always signing herself, your daughter, before they'd met. She also corresponded with Ken's sister, Dr. Jasmine McAlpin. Unusual for a woman at the time, Jasmine was a licensed physician, a graduate of the medical school for women in Baltimore. 12 years older than Ken, but never married, Jasmine had a medical office in downtown Butler, Pennsylvania, but still lived with her parents. Closing a letter to this formidable sister-in-law, quote, with much love, Agnes seemed to expect a warm welcome. Instead, she got a cold shoulder. Arriving at Ken's home 8 months pregnant after an exhausting transcontinental journey, Agnes was told to wait outside while Ken and his relatives decided where to put her. Finally, she was shown to a dismal room at the rear of the house above the kitchen. Ken, meanwhile, got a comfortable room in the main part of the house. As his mother and sister had told the neighbors, they felt disgraced by his marriage to a, quote, nearly full-blooded Indian and refused to view her or treat her as an equal. Only Ken's sick father showed Agnes any kindness, but he died a few months after her arrival. Over the next 2 years, Agnes gave birth to 2 sons. Ken was often absent from the house, resisting his mother's advice to attend dental school and earn a license, he took temporary jobs elsewhere in the country. Although Agnes was not shackled to the house, her movements were limited. Even when Ken sent money home, Jasmine put it all toward the general housekeeping, keeping Agnes penniless and dependent. Dressed in Jasmine's cast-offs, Agnes lived a Cinderella existence. This, by the way, that's the mother-in-law is on the left, probably a picture taken, many years before Agnes arrived, and that's Dr. Jasmine McAlpin to the right, the sister-in-law. A crisis came when Agnes found herself pregnant a third time. Agnes had no desire to terminate the pregnancy, but her husband and in-laws tried to force her to abort. For a month, Ken subjected her to nightly scalding hot baths while her mother-in-law brewed special teas for her. Emotional abuse had now turned physical. Nevertheless, the pregnancy continued, threatening to, quote, put the baby on the ash pile if it were born. Jasmine had Agnes meet with a colleague of hers who was said to perform abortions, which of course were strictly illegal at the time. When this doctor declined to take the case, Jasmine attempted the procedure herself. She left Agnes lying on the floor in agony, but still pregnant. Desperate to give birth safely and avoid further torture, Agnes wrote to her father, who was in Carta Bay, Prince of Wales Island, for $100, just enough for the train fare and steamboat fare home for herself and one child. At this point, she had 2 children, was pregnant with a third. A seemingly contrite Ken took her to the railroad depot, and Agnes set out for Alaska. So this is Agnes and her eldest son, Victor. She left Victor with her husband, and Victor was at the time 3 years old, and her husband promised to follow soon with him, but he never did. Instead, Victor died in Butler, perhaps of diabetes or typhoid. The reason are unclear. Death certificates were not required at the time, and the family buried him quietly after a home funeral, promising in letters to each other never to speak of the death again. Ken failed to inform Agnes of their child's death, leaving her to learn of it from an unsympathetic acquaintance. She found out shortly before giving birth to their third son. With her 2 surviving children, Sarah and Paul, Agnes stayed on Prince of Wales Island with her family for nearly 2 years. Even while grieving the loss of Victor, she found solace in nature, enjoyed the rowdy company of her younger brothers, and made new friends. However, her unclear marital status disturbed her. She learned that a friend of the McAlpins, who was related to a Ketchikan storekeeper, was spreading gossip through the mails about Agnes, saying that Agnes had fabricated her stories of mistreatment to disguise her own failings as a wife. Finally, letters from Ken, seemingly apologetic, promising that they could make a new start and that he had always loved her, lured Agnes back to his family home. In her absence, he'd enrolled in dental school and would soon be licensed. It might not be long, Agnes thought, until they had a home of their own. But her hopes were quickly shattered. For weeks after the arrival of Agnes and her children, and including the baby that the father had never seen, Ken failed to come home from dental school and pay a visit. Agnes was stuck in the house again with her mother-in-law and sister-in-law, both hostile as ever. They refused to answer questions about her son Victor's death, or even show her where he was buried. In tears, she explored a vast cemetery searching for the child's grave, until a church official took pity on her and pointed out the site. As Ken mostly stayed away, it became apparent that he'd grown close to another woman, someone his family had known for years. Moreover, his mother and sister gave this extramarital dalliance their wholehearted approval. When Ken fell ill with appendicitis shortly after his dental school graduation, they allowed this woman to bathe his face and hold his shaving mug, treating her with affection and acceptance as they barred Agnes from her husband's sick room. By now, the McAlpins' neighbors knew what was happening at the Oak Street house. Ken often spoke of Agnes insultingly to others who were secretly shocked. Likewise, his mother and sister had freely expressed their bigotry about Agnes's indigenous roots, unaware that their listeners found these views repugnant. Neighbors had seen Agnes crying in the woods behind their houses. Finally, Ken consulted the McAlpin family lawyer. This was someone who had drawn up his father's will before his father died, and someone that Kenneth had visited on his own. It was like an admired older person in the neighborhood, this lawyer, Henderson H. Goucher, someone that Ken thought of almost as an uncle. And he consulted him and asked him how he could, quote, get rid of Agnes. Instead, the attorney Henderson H. Goucher switched sides, offering to represent Agnes pro bono if she agreed to file for divorce first. She did. But first, she and the children needed to escape from the McAlpin house. With the help of attorney Goucher and his wife, as well as other neighbors, Agnes packed a trunk secretly and left with her sons as Ken's mother tried to block the door. Neighbors took turns sheltering the mother and the children in the many months until the case was heard. Testifying in a packed courtroom, Agnes wowed the crowd with the skills that sexism and colonialism had forced onto her. In a customs report, a special agent of the US Treasury had once mocked her Croatian grandfather's broken English. And her parents spoke English but couldn't read or write it well. However, Agnes was at ease in English and Haida. In fact, on her return to Prince of Wales Island, she had assisted a minister as an interpreter and finally earned a little money of her own. Moreover, her convent school was most likely St. Anne's Academy of Juneau, and stressing needlework over math and science, it aimed to turn its graduates into little ladies, and Agnes had learned her lessons well. Agnes's impressive performance on the witness stand rattled racist stereotypes a bit, but they quickly reemerged in a different form. A local paper, the Butler Eagle, wrote, quote, "For a time before the case came up for hearing, there was a widespread impression that the libelant Agnes McAlpin was an Indian or an Eskimo or some low-bred person devoid of all the finer instincts. And when instead a beautiful young woman possessing every attribute of the refined and cultured lady appeared, the surprise was notable." This was the era, of course, when many non-Native Americans applauded General Richard Pratt's advice to, quote, "kill the Indian and save the man." Just 200 miles from Butler, several of Agnes's relatives were attending Pratt's Carlisle Indian Industrial School. If Agnes's progress toward assimilation failed to meet Ken's standards, he spoke of her Juneau schooling with derision and called her an ignoramus in one of his letters. It nonetheless inspired the awe of the Butler Eagle. The judge presiding over the case, James M. Galbraith, quickly squelched Ken's main line of defense. Ken's lawyer began by arguing that his client's marriage to Agnes had resulted in Ken's ostracism from white society and ruined his dental practice, reducing him to a, quote, squaw man. And so you see the headline, this was in a lot of Pennsylvania papers at the time, because that Pittsburgh was covering the trial, and it even got attention in other cities. That offensive phrase, and I'm sorry to put it up here in a slide, was the title of a then popular stage play. This was, of course, before even silent movies were being shown in theaters in the United States, but plays would tour all over the United States, including in Butler. And Squaw Man was a popular one. And the play was about the disastrous union of a white man and an indigenous woman. The judge would listen no further to this argument. Quote, I will not permit anyone to disparage anyone because of birth, he said in rebuke, and that made headlines. Undercutting the argument further, a half dozen Alaskans sent depositions from Wrangell describing the high regard which Agnes had enjoyed there. And Butler, a parade of prominent citizens testified to Agnes's years of abuse. And the McAlpin family also had witnesses on their side, so there was a lot of conflicting testimony. Months later, the judge issued his decision, ruling in Agnes's favor. He noted that although a lot of the testimony was conflicting and contradictory, the one thing that the McAlpin family had never refuted is that they made all those racist remarks. So the judge awarded her a divorce and awarded her a modest alimony, but unfortunately, Ken never paid it. Instead, he disappeared, remarrying 3 more times and making all of his wives miserable, according to his descendants. And I'm going over my time, so I'm going to speed this up now. The Butler Eagle wrote that no case in the history of Butler County had inspired more interest, not only because the people involved were prominent in local society, but because everyone saw it as a fight for the rights of a little woman alone and over 4,000 miles from her people and friends. This is a story without a happy ending, and I'm going to wrap it up here. Unfortunately, Agnes briefly, she enrolled her sons, Sarah and Paul McAlpin, first in a Seattle public school, and then transferred them to the Chemawa school, which Diane Hirschberg happened to mention in her talks. And the school was very cruel to her and would not let her correspond with her older son, Sarah, and told Sarah that his mother didn't care about him and wasn't answering her letters, which they weren't even passing on to him. And they wouldn't allow her to visit him or take him out of school. Eventually, he was brought up by his grandparents in Prince of Wales Island. The school had determined, probably because some of Ken's allies were writing to the school, that Agnes was an unfit mother, and they chose to believe that. And it's not clear whether she saw much of her children as they grew up. She died at age 35 of tuberculosis, apparently alone. Her sons, Sarah and Paul, well, Sarah did not do well. He struggled with substance abuse his whole life. And Paul probably did better. He worked productively in Washington State, retiring in Bainbridge Island and living until old age. I just want to show the last slide. That's the letter from Agnes, but this one, thank you. This was her grandson, Mike McAlpin, his real name is Sarah, turned his life around by joining the Army in 1948 because both of his parents were substance abusers, so he had to take care of himself. And he became a paratrooper in the Korean War, a hero who jumped behind enemy lines and acted in Veterans Affairs in Ketchikan for the rest of his life. And I had the honor to meet him. He just passed away. I met him last summer, and he passed away this past August of 2023 at the age of 95. And he's survived by many loving children and grandchildren, and his wonderful Tlingit wife, Amelia, who has supported me throughout this project. But thank you so much. Good question, yes.
What drew you to this story? How did you learn of it from the get-go?
It's a long story. I would go over 20 minutes, but I was looking for some completely other information about Butler, Pennsylvania, which had experienced a typhoid epidemic. I was writing about typhoid in Pennsylvania, and I saw all these headlines, and I just thought how fascinating. But thanks for asking.
Good choice.
Any others?
Well, was it just the family that felt that way where they didn't want any association with indigenous or lower born peoples? Or was it, I can't believe that the way she looked in that community separated her. Because she was dressed Victorian, she looked, the part, she acted the part. So was it just the family or the community that ostracized her and set her aside?
Well, yeah, it was really just the family. The family kept telling the neighbors what they thought of her and didn't realize that the neighbors completely disagreed with them, for the most part. There were, at the divorce hearing, there were people who testified in favor of the family and said that Agnes was exaggerating, that the room over the kitchen wasn't all that bad, and it wasn't, that the things she had to do as Kenneth's husband weren't all that different from circumstances that other wives experienced at the time. So I guess once people found out about her Haida origins, there were mixed reactions, but for the most part, certainly the press was very in favor of Agnes and demonize the family. I maybe didn't demonize the family, they were demons. So, but they were as such. Yeah, anybody else? Yes.
We are familiar with Pennsylvania, and Pittsburgh would be a ethnical community because so many Europeans and immigrants settled there as a major industry in that area. So I'm guessing that in the early 1900s, people from different places were not unusual in that region.
You're absolutely right. There were a lot of Europeans coming to Butler. Butler had some major manufacturing at the time, including a company that made streetcars. And it actually made the cars that people rode on, and that was a huge industry at that time. But those people were sometimes called foreigners and looked at, in the local paper, they'd be foreigners forever, no matter if they lived in Butler for 30 or 40 years. So it isn't that Butler was free of bigotry. There was a Black community there also that had a very hard time starting up a church. And they'd ask the mayor not to let the local, the local theater, and when I say theater, I'm talking about live performances, not to stage the Klansman, which is a very racist play that later became a movie. And they started a petition, and some white people supported the Black community with that, but the mayor ignored them. So it's not that Butler was a hotbed of civil rights sentiment at the time, but there were people who were questioning all racial discrimination. I would say Agnes found some very good allies, and the judge was years ahead of his time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Saw Ray Hudson's picture up there, and many of us probably know Ray from his years of living in Alaska and the Aleutian. So Ray Hudson, who's our next speaker, it switched to, it was going to be Mike Livingston, but he and Mike have switched, so we'll get all three. But Ray was a public school teacher in Alaska for 28 years before moving to the East Coast. He writes primarily about Aleutian history and ethnography. The Imaginary Frontier and Its True Poverty was selected for the Morgan and Jean Sherwood Alaska Historical Award for the best article published by the Society in 2022. His most recent manuscript explores the history and techniques of evolution basketry, which is something that he is well known for throughout his career. And we're thrilled to see Ray again, even though he's on the East Coast. Let's see, I don't know, tea time there, I guess. Anyway, we welcome Ray, and I assume Ray can hear and is ready to go, right?
I am. Thank you very much. Thanks so much. And thank you for letting me speak from this great distance from actually from the unceded land of the Western Abenaki here in central Vermont. When my brothers and sisters went to school, Philemon Tudikoff recalled in 1974, they had to learn English in order to learn. I think about the time I came along was when they began to use English all over instead of just outside the home. Born in 1927, Phil was among the first generation to grow up speaking English as a first language instead of Unangam Tunu. As the Unanga language began to make a comeback in the 1970s, he regretted this circumstance and did what he could to incorporate words from Unangam Tunu into his talks. Phil served as chairman of the Aleutian People of Highlands Association, the federally recognized tribal organization of the Aleut people, from 1980 to 1985. API had formed in 1976 through the merger of two nonprofits. It was relatively young, flexing its muscles and initiating several projects of importance. Foremost among these was securing reparations for the harm done to individuals and communities during World War II. It was also an organization in crises. Only 2 years into his service, he was recognized for generous and profound contributions. Quote, his vision, leadership, compassion, courage, and determination, wrote Greg Brailsford, then APIA director, have guided and sustained myself, the board, and API generally through APIA's rebirth and renewal as a powerful and effective tribal organizational body, unquote. Phil was the youngest child of two remarkable individuals, the activist and basket weaver Anfisia Shepstikov and Michael Tudikoff, both products of the educational system championed by a succession of Orthodox priests and laymen in the region. He and Anfisia, that is, Michael and Anfisia, were literate in Russian, Unangam Tunu, and English. Michael's minutes of church committee meetings housed in the Russian church collection at the Library of Congress are an invaluable and untapped source of information. Michael was an accomplished musician who played the violin and wrote music. He died in the Reykjavik native in 1933. Phil was born with tuberculosis of the spine. The pain of that condition, compounded by the trauma of his father's sudden death, erased most memories he had of his father, an absence that haunted him throughout his life. Anfisia was left with 6 children, including 2 whom she and Michael had adopted. In 1937, she entered a marriage arranged by Chief Alexei Yechmenov to the widower Sergei Shepstikov. They adopted yet another child. Phil credited Sergei, whom his stepchildren called friend, with his understanding of the importance of Unanga culture. Because of health problems, Phil's schooling began late and was frequently interrupted. A greater disruption occurred in July 1942 when Unanga from Unalaska were sent to Southeast Alaska as part of the removal of the native population following the attack on the Aleutians. A year into this exile, Sergei Shepstikov drowned near Tla'aquan. Phil was enrolled at the Wrangell Institute, a BIA boarding school. After 1 year, he was determined to find a better school with the help of an old brother. He enrolled in the Wrangell Public School. The BIA principal, however, won what Phil called a hollering match with his sister, and he had to return to the institute as a ward of the government. It eventually took him 5 years to complete his remaining 1.5 years of high school. In March 1949, back at Unalaska, while still in high school, he ran for city council, prompting the council to ask the attorney general if a student of any age could hold office. He graduated in 1951. Philemon Michael Tudikoff, what a name, When enrolling at the Wrangell Institute, Unanga children found the lines on the forms far too short to accommodate most given and Russian surnames. Many of our first names would take up all the space, Phil wrote. We didn't realize that there was that much importance attached to a name, how it was spelled. They just rolled out of our mouths. It was kind of an eye-opener for us to realize that our names were kind of funny, they sounded kind of funny, and they looked kind of funny in print. Once, when visiting a Baptist church, he was asked to stand while the pastor introduced him. And glancing at Phil's name, however, the pastor asked Phil to introduce himself because, quote, he couldn't read Alaskan, quote. There isn't time to go through Phil's young adult life when he was absent from the Aleutians for 8 years, primarily in Kodiak and San Francisco. These were years when his letter writing matured. Those to his mother showed a young man struggling to find his place in the world. Back in the Aleutians, after the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act became law, he held a series of jobs in the post office, the school, and various social service and Native organizations. For years, he was an unpaid or dramatically underpaid health aide when, as he irreverently put it, he worked for Jesus. He attended numerous conferences, most dealing with health and social services. In May 1977, he was a delegate from Alaska to the White House Conference on the Handicapped in Washington, D.C., a meeting he titled with his characteristic in political incorrectness, "A Gathering of the Afflicted." While there, he encountered a stultifying humidity. "I know what a swamp feels like," he wrote in what would be a prelude to numerous trips to the national capital as APIA intensified its work on World War II reparations that had been ignited by Patrick Plotnikoff in 1977. The year Phil became chairman of APIA was the same year President Carter signed a bill that established a 9-member commission on wartime relocation and internment of civilians. In November 1980, Phil traveled to California for a meeting with Japanese Americans. His testimony before the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations was the most personal and passionate of the several that he would give in the coming years. Phil died in 1985, 3 years before the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands Restitution Act was signed into law by President Reagan in August 1988. When John Kirtland, APIA's lead attorney, sent Phil's widow, Flora, a copy of the published 1984 hearings, he wrote, "We will desperately miss Phil's determined and selfless leadership, his impassioned and effective testimony, and his personal commitment to the Aleut people." This commitment has yet to find its fullest expression. Phil's writings can inform and inspire generations to come. At present, they are either unpublished or buried in old issues of various newsletters and journals. This material consists of testimony, articles, exhortations, and occasionally scoldings. In addition, he wrote long, brilliant letters. A glimpse of his broad and rhythmic penmanship heralded a cascade of words that pushed all other correspondence aside. There was nothing quite like a letter from him. Taken as a whole, his writings provide an Unanga view of Unanga history from the early 1930s through the mid-1980s. They cover the hectic pre-World War II years, the deprivations and struggles of the evacuation, the heroic years of rebuilding after the war, the rise of local and regional corporations, and the gradual emergence of a vigorous Unanga identity. Phil's writing was frank and uncompromising, so much so that his originals were sometimes toned down by editors before publication. He could be deliberately provocative and, as I've mentioned, politically incorrect to an enthusiastic degree. It is precisely this vigor and truthfulness that make them not only historically important, but relevant and motivational. Here's just one short example. It's the beginning of a letter of almost 4,000 words that details his wait in DC to see if the Aleut reparations bill would pass. It was written September 29th, 1984, and the bill did not pass. The doldrums, Lent, 8 months pregnant, one more note left, one more brush stroke or stroke, putting your key in your room, house, car, lock, waiting in line to tinkle, eat, pay for groceries, paycheck, mail, getting chewed out, waiting for the damned bus, plane, train, taxi, or TV commercial, phone to ring, doorbell, the other shoe to fall, the seal's head to surface, the car to start, jug star to open, darkness, daybreak, a date, an assignation, a prognosis, a diagnosis, preparation H to do its thing, roll aid to hit bottom, room service to open, a telephone conversation, the location of the nearest lavatory, the final buzzer, the football to fall into the hands of the skinny wide receiver, the quarterback to regain his feet, the umpire signal, the baseball to fall into the left fielder's glove who comes from Central America and sends his paycheck to the rebels, waiting to go to bed, waiting to go home, waiting for a welcome or unwelcome guest, waiting for the kettle pot to boil, waiting for any kind of an answer from any kind of a student or interested, disinterested, happy, unhappy, well-groomed, slovenly dressed, tall, short, fat, skinny, sweating, calm, red, black, brown, yellow, tan, ruddy, bearded, shaven no glasses, bespectacled, fragrant, smelly, angry, pleased person. What can I tell you? This has been the most agonizing time of my short, long life. The staff and I are all waiting for word as to whether or not the Aleut World War II reparation bill will pass in October in its entirety, or just part of it, or whether we must return to Alaska, I to an Alaska, and tell an Aleut or any damned one person that we must all wait until January 1985. He ended this long letter with, the prayers I offered up last Sunday were no different than the ones I've offered up in the many churches I've been in the past, regardless of religious persuasion. I know I've received much more than I ever expected. I am an extremely fortunate man. Say hello to the good people in Unalaska. The others, though, they are never far from me in my head. Phil's writings detail the immense difficulties Unanga of the mid-20th century faced. They show a man willing to confront prejudice, corporate snarls, and personal demons. In the last years of his life, he began to call all Unanga, those who agreed with him and those who didn't, the best people on earth. This generosity of spirit is embedded in his writings. Many thanks to everybody, to the Historical Society, and to all of those who helped organize this conference. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing if I can.
Thanks, Ray. I think we probably have some questions, which I will, oh, you're there so you can see. Hi.
Yep, I'm here. I can't get out of my screen, unfortunately.
Well, I have one question. What are your plans for, what do you plan to do with the writings of Philemon Tudiakov?
Yeah, well, I've worked with his family on them, and they're extremely voluminous, and so I'm trying to pare them down into a more manageable shape, and then I'd like to submit them to a publisher to see if they could to see if they'd be willing to publish them. I think they'd be interested not only to Ananga people, but just to people in general. He was extremely articulate, very funny at times, and a number of the letters and the talks are very moving.
Well, this is just an observation that the piece that you read was very poetic. And as a poet yourself, it seems it's literature, it's not just information, which is.
I agree entirely. I agree entirely.
So any questions for Ray from those of us?
Did anyone take up the cause that he left?
Oh yes, yes. I mean, a number of Onoga folks continued, and eventually, the reparations bill was passed, and it's provided a lot of wonderful services in the chain, including the repairs on a number of Orthodox churches that were damaged during the period. Nobody, I think, no one has his facility with English, and he was very unique in the eloquence with which he was able to express his ideas.
I think I saw another question.
How long did he live in the Aleutians, or did he live in Washington DC in his later years?
No, he lived he lived it on Alaska, and he would just travel to DC, or I mean, APIA headquarters are in Anchorage, so we'd have to go to Anchorage for meetings and things, or then to DC for various congressional hearings and things of that sort. But he lived in the Aleutians, and he died in Alaska.
That is a long trip.
Ray, can you comment on any continuities between Phil's style of writing in English and the traditional Onoga storytelling or literature?
Oh, very interesting comment or question. And I don't think I really can. As Phil said, he was of that generation that grew up speaking English as their primary language, and he could understand, quite a bit of Unungutunu, not fluently, I don't think. And so I don't know how much his style was influenced by storytelling, and I'm not even sure how much storytelling existed during his childhood. The bulk of the stories that we have were collected in 1909, 1910. And so long before Phil was born. And I'm trying to think, there was some occasionally some dancing, some singing out on Alaska, but I'm not sure that storytelling to children was part of his education. But I mean, someone could perhaps make a study of Phil's writings and see if there were any similarities for repetition or things of that sort. Phil wrote only one fictional account, an account of an Aleut or Nunanga around the time of the arrival of the Russians. It's fairly long, it's incomplete, and it's, I think, primarily of interest because of the things that he had been taught himself about Aleut culture prior to the publication of a lot of materials. For example, prior to the publication of Veniaminov's notes on the Unalaska district. You have to remember that a lot of the ethnographic information that we have came towards the very end of the 20th century, and Phil's work was primarily quite a bit before that.
So, yes.
Did he write any music?
Did he write any music? No, Phil didn't. His father did. Unfortunately, almost all of their records were destroyed during the World War II evacuation. There was, I think, a single sheet or maybe two sheets of music that survived in his handwriting from the evacuation years.
Ray, I don't know if you heard Diane Hirschberg's talk. Did you?
I did, yes.
So she talked about the Wrangell Institute. Do you have any more details about Phil's time there?
I don't. I know Gertrude Zavarny has spoken about it being a very difficult time. Part of the problem at the time of the evacuation was that the Wrangell Institute almost doubled its population when all the Onoga children, were placed there at the institute, or those of the appropriate age were placed there. And Gertrude recalled that they had to work every other week or 1 week a month or something of that sort, and she had to work in the laundry. And I don't know what Phil had to do. I don't know.
Thanks. Yes, we have another question.
We know Ray as many kinds of writer, including poet. I would just like to quote him a couple of instances that I know of. He talked of Sheldon Jackson's division of Alaska into Protestant territory as like dividing Joseph's coat, which I think is so beautiful. In another instance, he's my expert to go to, so dear Ray, what do you think of this? I read the strangest origin story of the Jesse Lee home. It was more fiction than fact. And he said, well, why don't they just say the Russians founded the Jesse Lee home shortly before they arrived in Alaska?
We might hear more about the Jesse Lee home in the next talk.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm Alaskan.
No, I wrote this history of the Jesse Lee home in Alaska, and I really think that if I were to write it now, I would probably have more. There'd be different ways of thinking about it, you know, as a boarding school. There was only one person, Edna Pelagay McCurdy, who spoke negatively about the school. And it was very hard for me to find anyone who has had any negative things about the school. But perhaps, although most of those people have unfortunately passed away by now, but perhaps if I had been more alert at the time when I was writing it, I could have asked questions that might have elicited some more information.
We have one more question.
As Alaska Native, I'm interested in three cultures or histories of cultures that influence that area, both Russian, American, and his own indigenous culture. Did he have a preference in his recollection between the English or Russian histories?
His mother definitely did, because she attended the Russian school at Unalaska. I don't think Phil did. Phil had such an ability to span cultures and to talk with anyone about any subject whatsoever. He was very open about his beliefs and so on. He was a passionate member of the Orthodox Church, and was at the same time was very liberal in many of his attitudes towards life. I think he just as he always struggled to find out more about his father. I think he did the same thing about his native culture, his Ononga culture, that he was always interested in delving more into it, and would study anything that happened to come out or talk with anyone who might know more about it. He was fortunate. He worked with some elders, Bill Chapanow from Akutan, Sergei Savarov from Nikolsky, when they came to Unalaska, and when he was younger up in the Pribilof Islands occasionally with elders.
Well, thank you, Ray. We really appreciate
You're welcome.
that.
Thank you very much, everybody. I'm delighted that it's possible for people who can't get to Alaska at the moment to be part of the conference.